If the FS7 is old and crusty, then this is the new hotness. This is the FX9, the new production camera from Sony. Sony are keen to have you believe that this is not a successor to the FS7 because they still want to sell that camera. But for all intents and purposes, of course it is. The FX9 is a very similar form factor and offers many of the same features as that beloved and popular production camera, but with a whole lot more to boot. Importantly, Sony have worked very hard to ensure that this camera can be dropped straight into an existing workflow, whether for a solo shooter or a production studio, to replace or complement the FS7. Welcome back to Hot Lunch. I'm Gareth and behind the camera is Paul. We do reviews of camera equipment from the point of view of owner-operators who actually have to use them. So we go somewhat into detail, a little bit more than you're going to get from the camera entertainment shows, but a little bit less than you're going to get from the hyper techie shows. We're going to show you real world use and how we found this new and exciting camera in the field. Thanks once again to Camera Kit in Dublin for lending us not just the camera to review, but a full kit to go with it, including tripod, V-mount power, and a powered zoom lens. We've got a slightly different zoom lens this week from the 18 to 110 we had last week. This is the 28 to 135 f4 powered zoom lens from Sony, and this is the lens that you'll get if you buy the camera as a kit. So how does this camera differ from its predecessor? Well, the FS7, as we spoke about last week, is a very capable production camera with a beautiful color gamut and a fine, sharp and readily gradable image. But we have an entirely new sensor system in this camera. It is a full frame camera with a 6K sensor, although you'll only be getting 4K imagery out of it. It's downsampled in camera. They've also added essentially world-class autofocus, really for the first time in a Sony camera, and possibly something that's better than what's available even in Canon cinema cameras like the C300 or the C200, which have had that dual pixel autofocus for many years. The ergonomics have changed slightly, but as I mentioned, this really is designed to be swapped in and out so that an FS7 user who's comfortable with that camera can very quickly learn the differences and how to get up and running with this camera. We've got a new processor inside, so the menu system is much more fluid and fast, although it retains many of the issues with the existing Sony menu system. Another difference is the dual ISO system, which changes how this camera responds to light radically, especially in terms of low light performance. And of course, we have improved exposure tools. As we spoke about last week in our FS7 review, there were many limitations with that camera in terms of how you could preview footage in different settings, and some of those limitations have been lifted here. Overall, what you're getting is a more capable camera in every way. A camera that's capable not only of shooting Super 35 footage to match the FS7 with those new tools and add-ons that we mentioned, but also a full frame camera that can shoot in that new perspective that's so beloved of cinematographers at the moment, say like Roger Deakins in 1917, which gives you that wider field of view and a strangely different perspective on the world. So Sony made a decision here to keep the file formats the same as on the FS7. So while you're getting an oversampled image from that 6K sensor down to 4K, what you're getting is files that are just as easy to edit as you'll be familiar with from the FS7. They are sharper though. As with the GH5, having a larger resolution sensor downsampling to 4K means that the final footage will look better, will be discernibly better on a 4K screen. And it's something that Sony are keen to point out. Many cameras, such as the Blackmagics that we're shooting this on right now, while technically 4K, are in fact upsampling because the debayering process loses some of the resolution of the sensor. So you're not really seeing 4K, whereas this is giving you 4K downsample from 6K, so you're going to get a brighter and more clarified image. Canon took a very different tack with their C500 Mark II, which is essentially, although much more expensive, the full frame alternative to this camera in a similar budget range. That camera shoots 6K rather than 4K, although the sensor is much the same size. What that means is that although you have access to that 6K image, which may in some circumstances be sharper, you do have to deal with much larger files, especially when shooting RAW. And it's worth noting that the C500 Mark II does shoot RAW internally, while this camera will need an expensive add-on to do that. All of that adds up to mean that this is a much better run and gun camera than the FS7 Mark II. Everything has been honed and tightened up, from the speed of the camera to the addition of new functionality, to make this a camera that you can quickly turn around both on location and in post. As I mentioned, we borrowed not just the camera body, but this full kit, including the 28 to 135 sensor. So this is kind of like moving from a micro four thirds to a super 35 sensor. On the same lenses, your effective focal length changes. So this 28 is very, very similar to the 18 on the previous FS7. So you have to bear that in mind. If you do want to shoot in that sharper 6K full sensor readout mode, your lenses are going to be wider than they were before, and that might result in vignetting. So that expanded field of view is something that we ran into ourselves. Not only were we borrowing this 28 to 135 powered lens, but we also borrowed one of the Zeiss CP3 lenses. These are Zeiss's newest range of compact primes, and this is the 85. Now, we had to adapt this because this is an EF mount lens, and unfortunately we used the wrong Metabones adapter. We used a 0.71 Metabones Ultra adapter, as you might use on an FS7 to get a full frame look. We didn't think before borrowing it that in fact we'd need a focal reducer that didn't expand the field of view, either a dumb adapter or a different adapter from Metabones. So there's two that suit. What should work is a T-Smart or Cine adapter from Metabones, or even just a dumb EF mount adapter that doesn't change the field of view. Otherwise you'll get vignetting, and although you can eliminate that by pushing it in post, you're going to be losing some of that full frame of resolution. So bear that in mind when you look at our footage today. We have some lovely samples from the Zeiss lens, but they're not going to be as sharp as you would get using the full frame, because these lenses do cover all of the full frame sensor, and the entire CP3 range of lenses covers all of the full frame sensor. The previous version of these lenses, the CP2s, I believe all of them except for the very widest, I think that's the 18mm, covered the full frame, but you would have had an issue with that widest lens. So bear that in mind if you're getting those secondhand. This is a fantastic lens and we had a great time using it. So let's look at the improvements that the FX9 brings to the table. I think there's very few camera people on the planet who can't be excited by this camera, because it's bringing all the functionality of a familiar and comfortable camera that any studio would be happy to get footage from, but it's adding stuff. And the stuff it's adding is really exciting, especially in a cinema camera. We're used with DSLRs having a lot of these convenient features built in, but with that reduced picture quality and without the functionality of things like your built-in ND that you'll get on a camera like this, or running all day from V-mount batteries. But combining the usability that they've brought in from the A7 range and their other smaller DSLRs with the capabilities that were already in the camera, we're getting something pretty special. So what are those features? So first up, the zoom on this 28 to 135 is much improved on the zoom on the 18 to 110 that we reviewed last week. It's smoother, faster, more responsive, so you're getting more rapid control and less latency between your push of the button, whether on the lens or on the camera grip, and the response in the lens. And you're getting a smoother response curve and more fine-grained control in general over how quickly the zoom happens and how smoothly it happens. The image quality was also better on this lens, although I assume that's more to do with the sensor and less to do with the lens. But it's important to note that your kit lens will look a little bit better. It's still a kit lens, but it's very usable in a lot of situations where the kit lens on the FS7, although useful for production work, really can get noticeable, especially in artificial light situations. Another thing that's sharper is the S and Q footage. S and Q on the FS7 was a little soft and a little muddy. It's an older camera and it's really kind of noticeable coming from the Blackmagics, where you have essentially identical sharpness in your slow motion footage as you do in your regular 25 or 30 frames per second shooting. On this camera, slow motion is very sharp, but there are some issues with it, which I'll get to. So the camera's ergonomics have been improved, and that's most noticeable initially in this menu scroll wheel. You have several methods of navigating the menus this time, as well as the hand grip that you had on the FS7. You also have a kind of a D-pad here at the back of the camera, but you can readily hop into and change menu items from this scroll wheel at the front. That does mean that the ND filter is no longer controlled from a wheel in that position. It's controlled from a wheel that's slightly over to what's on your, basically beside your ear when you have the camera shoulder mounted, which is convenient but a little confusing initially. More importantly, the menus respond much more quickly. So one of the issues that a lot of people had with the FS7 was that it's kind of laggy when you're going through the menus. These are long and often complicated menus, but that's hugely improved here. The processor in the camera is better, and the menus hop up really, really quickly. The camera also turns on incredibly quickly. In general, it responds to whatever you want to do, be it changing modes, let's say between 4K and 6K, or shooting, stopping shooting, all of that, those kinds of operations and input-output stuff happens very quickly on this camera, really unusually quickly for a cinema camera, and it's very pleasant to use in that regard. We had an incident earlier when we were heading out to shoot this today, when a heron hopped into my garden, and I was able to throw the camera up my shoulder, turn it on, and begin filming almost immediately. There was no 5 or 10 second wait as you might get with a lot of other cinema cameras. The new sensor is back illuminated, which means that you're just going to get less noise overall, but more importantly, it is a dual ISO sensor, just like the Blackmagic. But where the Blackmagic sensor is around about 400 and 1200 native ISO, this camera is 800 and 4000 ISO, which is, especially considering the built-in ND, a far more sensible setup. So you can do basically all your daily shooting around the 800 range if you're shooting outside. And when you go inside or you're shooting at night, you have that great 4000 base ISO to work from, which means that a street scene under street light at night, let's say you're shooting verite, you're shooting documentary, or you're shooting even a narrative piece which doesn't want to have a lot of additional lighting, is going to be perfectly visible. And that's a huge improvement over the somewhat subpar 2000 native ISO on the FS7, which in low light really didn't compete with more modern cameras. You're going to see less noise in general in the shadows on this camera, both because it has a back illuminated sensor and because it is a 6K sensor, both of which increase the light that's being absorbed by the camera. There's also a newer processing pipeline in the camera and better denoising in general. So generally noise wasn't an issue for really any of the shots that we took. It's not a huge issue on the FS7 with a decent amount of light either, but anything which reduces noise and gives you more options in low light is brilliant. This is one I haven't seen mentioned anywhere. The E-mount, although pretty much identical in functionality, the locking E-mount on the front of this camera is much smoother and better to use than the FS7 that we tried out. Now I'm not sure if that's because that was an older rental unit whose E-mount had gotten a little bit wonky over time, or because this has been improved, but this is very much more smooth, quick to respond. It felt more secure and really just had a lot less issues and worries using this E-mount. And it's not just having a week's more experience, it really did lock the lens better. So the enhanced processing and the experience that Sony have had over the years with the menu system have led to improvements in what you can preview simultaneously in the monitor on the camera. So we had some issues when we were shooting on the FS7 with not being able to simultaneously see a LUT and also waveform preview. It turns out you can actually see both on the FS7, but you have to turn on a very specific set of settings. Some things can be on, some things can't be on. Otherwise you're disabling the ability to see, say, a waveform monitor while you're shooting. This camera gets rid of a lot of that complexity. You can change the focus peak and color, which we couldn't seem to get working on the FS7. There's also a new paint setting, which is called S-Cinetone. Now, I call it a paint setting because it's in the paint menu. It's not so intuitive how you change the color controls in these cameras. For example, there isn't immediately a one-button control set up on the camera to change between S-Cinetone and another color gamut. But once you get it set up, it's a far more pleasing, if perhaps technically less accurate, burned in LUT for custom mode. So as I mentioned last week, there's two ways of shooting on these cameras. You can shoot in custom mode with your burned in LUT, or you can shoot in Cine EI mode. And when you're shooting in custom mode, now you have this new option for something which is a much nicer turnaround, especially in natural light. It sacrifices some dynamic range, so your highlights won't be quite as well preserved. But if you're running and gunning, the new S-Cinetone, like I say, especially in natural light, does really look great. think it does have some of the same issues that you see in the FS7 with tungsten, where it can look more, I think of it as chemical, I don't know why, more artificial and less natural than your log. But it's still a great alternative for many scenarios, and it's great to have it built in there. It's designed to look similar to the Sony Venice colors. You can also, for the first time, change the white balance in Cine EI mode. On the FS7, you were stuck with the 3 preset white balance settings. Now you can change to any white balance, or you can use the auto white balance button while shooting in log. So one big question I had coming into the camera was, is this really going to let you punch in to that Super 35 scale? So if you already own G-Master lenses, or you own adapted glass, let's say with a Metabones you're using Canon glass, will this just let you punch in and keep the same quality as the FS7? Because a lot of cameras, when you punch in for your 1080 mode, say, look worse than native 1080 cameras. And I'm pleased to say that the Super 35 footage really does look equivalent in terms of sharpness, although with the better color science, with the autofocus and the new features, as you're going to see on the FS7. So that means that you're getting a sharper image when you switch, and of course wider field of view when you switch to the 6K sensor. But you can use the camera perfectly well in Super 35. So if you want to buy the body now and buy a lens later that fits that wider field of view, or maybe you're comfortable with your workflow for Super 35, but you want to have the functionality and you don't ever want to use the 6K of the sensor to get that wider field of view, then you can do that, and it works perfectly well, and you do get all the advantages of the newer camera. The monitor overall is of a better quality. It's sharper and clearer, and as a result it's much easier to tell what's in focus, and it's much easier to see the peaking and exactly what is peaking if you have that setting turned on. But in general I felt pretty much comfortable shooting even with peaking turned off. This is a 720 monitor, and I don't know what the DPI is on the monitor. I wasn't able to find out, although I did actually check Sony's website, so let us know in the comments if you know yourself. But I think the DPI is improved, the dots per inch. So while 720 might not sound like a super high resolution, this is a much clearer screen when using the viewfinder than, let's say, even the Blackmagic, which is a 1080 screen. So you're going to get a clear, sharp screen, which would be absolutely great for seeing distant subjects and whether they're in focus or not. So to my issues with the camera, like I say, look, this is a fun camera to use. The additional usability really does matter in the field. I felt much more with this camera that the golden question when you're out shooting, certainly the kind of shooting that I do, is if something happens, can I get it quickly? And with this camera, with the autofocus being so good, with the auto ND being so good, and I didn't really talk about that, but it's a great way of controlling exposure when you're in bright light and you don't want to be faffing around, you can just slap it on. I felt a lot more comfortable that I was going to be able to get the footage that I needed, but it's not a perfect camera. It has many issues, and they're the kind of Sony issues that you run into with any Sonys around how the camera adapts itself to you versus you adapting yourself to the camera. So first off, I should mention that this camera doesn't natively have RAW. Now RAW is coming to the camera with a firmware update in October, but even then you're going to need a lot of additional stuff to be able to use it. Quite an expensive and bulky device that clips on to the end of the camera. If you're using a V-mount adapter like this, you won't need to use that anymore because a V-mount adapter is built into that add-on, but it's several €1,000. And additionally, even with the add-on, you can't yet record RAW because you'll still need an external recorder, and one that's capable of taking that 16-bit RAW. The monitors that will be able to record that are not your Atomos Ninja line of kind of cheap or low to mid-range hardware recorders. You're going to need a more expensive hardware recorder, something like the Atomos Shogun 7, which is a 7-inch monitor. And I think so far all the monitors that have been announced that do support recording RAW from this camera in ProRes RAW are 7-inch or larger. And that's not just because those are the kind of monitors that DOPs often like to use. It's also because the processing in a smaller monitor probably won't be there to deal with this very, very heavy 16-bit RAW footage. What that means in practice is that you're probably not going to be able to run and gun RAW with this camera ever, unless you have an easy rig or a very, very bulky camera operative, because you're going to have a 7-inch monitor on board attached to the camera and this add-on plus a V-mount battery. So all of which means that if you want to shoot RAW, this probably isn't your camera unless you're talking about RAW in a studio or film set environment. So the menus are still confusing and they're still irritating. There are issues with the menus here and how you change modes in the camera that really just make no sense to me. For example, you cannot one button change between Cine EI and custom mode. As far as I can tell, there's no way to set that up. You can set up a custom mode to go into the user menu to the point where you're going to make that change, but you still need to go into the menu, you need to select the mode that you want, and you need to change it. Similarly, you can't easily change between 4K and 6K. You need to go into the menu, you need to select 6K or 4K, and you need to execute that change on the camera. The camera very, very rapidly resets into the new mode. There's no issue with the delay, but it's the functionality. And the reason that that's a problem with the 4K and the 6K is that this camera does not support currently any kind of slow motion when shooting in the full sensor 6K mode. Now that will change to some extent later this year. In October, they're releasing a firmware patch, one of the functions of which is to give you a new mode, which is around about, I think, 5K of the sensor, so close to full frame, which will give you 50 and 60p. Right now, if you want to shoot S and Q, you have to go into the menu, change into 4K mode, then go into the S and Q settings, and then tell it, I want to shoot in 50 or 60 frames a second. It doesn't remember whether you did that before or not. So when you go back into 6K, it limits the S and Q to 30 frames, which isn't slow motion. And when you switch back again into 4K, it forgets that you had it in 50 or 60. So that means that your changeover time is, 15, 30 seconds, whatever it is, even when you really get it down. You can't just one button slow motion. And I see that as a huge limitation, as is only being able to shoot slow motion currently on the current firmware in that 4K mode. It's really something that should have been in the camera when it came out. Slow motion might not be something a lot of shooters use, but for myself, someone who came from the DSLR world, I use it all the time for two major reasons. One, it doubles the length of your cutaways, which means that you get more faster. And two, it smooths out motion. So if you're hand holding a camera or even shoulder mounting a camera, you do get that smoother motion when it's slow motion. So obviously people argue that slow motion is overused and so on. That should be up to the camera operative and the editor to decide, not the camera. There is some fan noise in the camera. It's not a huge issue, as you can actually set it in the menu to only cool actively when it's not shooting, although it might kick in when the camera overheats anyway. It's not something we ran into, and I think you can shoot for quite a while without that fan kicking in, maybe even up to an hour, unless you're in a very hot environment. But it's something to be aware of if you're in a very noise sensitive situation. I will say that the fan is not particularly annoying or distracting, unless you're dealing with a camera mounted microphone, in which case it would be audible. This is a 6K sensor, and as such, rolling shutter is an issue. It doesn't have a global shutter, so the rolling shutter is worse in 6K mode than you'll be familiar with either from the 4K mode on this or the 4K mode on your FS7. It's not terrible, but it is something to be aware of. You're not going to be doing super whip pans without any rolling shutter jelly. Another irksome detail, and this is something that maybe bothered me as a non-Sony shooter, I think the buttons are dreadful on this camera. So the Apple butterfly keyboard has been rightly criticized for having buttons that don't give a lot of feedback, but that's really what you're getting on here. You're getting buttons that in some cases click and in some cases don't, but have a kind of a mushy feeling all of the time. And there are a few buttons that are really, really annoying. One is the ND Auto. Now, I was using ND Auto to ensure proper exposure in bright light because I'm not super familiar with shooting in Cine EI, and I wanted to make sure that it wasn't pushing up those highlights too much, and also just because it's a very convenient way of automatically using that built-in ND. But turning it on requires a really awkward, very firm button press that really often took me out of using the camera, and I had to take it off the shoulder and do it by hand, and the buttons are not backlit. So while there is a lighting indicator that goes on when you're using auto gain, white balance or shutter, none of which again work in Cine EI on this camera. They didn't in the FS7 either. The camera itself doesn't feel cheap at all. It's magnesium to reduce the weight, but it doesn't have a tacky or cheap feeling. It feels like a solid quality camera, and I really feel like it could fall down some stairs and still work. But it's just that button feeling that just doesn't give me the feedback or the comfort that I would get from buttons on many other consumer devices. So this is a minor criticism, but similar to the FS7, when you hit display to hide all of your meters and so on while recording, there's no tally indicator. And of course that's common to these cameras, but say on the Blackmagic, you get a small red bar at the bottom, even when you clear the other indicators, which just lets you know yeah, you're definitely rolling. So the autofocus, as I mentioned, is really excellent. It has a variety of modes, including face priority and face only. But one issue that we run into is that it does get a little bit confused with hats and even in some cases glasses. Now, it's not as big an issue as you might think because the autofocus is so good that it will default to tracking an object, which is presumably your subject, if they are center framed, even if it doesn't pick up their face. But it is something to be aware of, that it can quite easily become obscured or confused. If you're out there in the field, say at a corporate event or a live sporting event, and you're using those excellent autofocus controls, you want to make sure that you never go beyond the exposure that the camera is happy with, because if you do, you're going to lose autofocus completely. So that's where you might want to be using that auto ND feature that's built in. But if you're tracking someone through a crowd, let's say you've registered a face, which is another great feature, you can teach it to remember a particular face so it doesn't lose that person. And then you lose that face autofocus, then you're going to lose control of what it's focusing on altogether. For many people who are shooting narrative, or they're using autofocus in only very limited circumstances, it might not matter. But if you want to run and gun with this all the time, you're probably going to want to stick on that auto ND feature a lot, just to make sure you never go beyond the level of light that's going to ruin the autofocus for you. So the battery use in the FS7 is pretty fantastic. You're going to get through an entire day probably with at most 2 148 watt hour V-mount batteries. But this uses batteries about twice as much. It makes sense. It's a much more powerful camera with much more functionality. It's much more quick. It's not really a criticism. It's just a fact of life with these cameras. It's also true of the Canons. As cameras become more powerful, they need more power. We shoot on the Blackmagics and they are absolute drinkers of juice. They're alcoholics when it comes to electricity. And this one likes to drink too. So as I mentioned last week, the FS7 and now the FX9 has 2 shooting modes. There's Cine EI for shooting log, and there's also custom for shooting with a built-in LUT and more automatic settings enabled on the camera. When you're in Cine EI, it's a little hard to get used to from a DSLR or really any other camera person's point of view, because it doesn't work the way ISO or gain works. You're not adding an additional amount of exposure by increasing the light or the power that's being put into the sensor. What you're doing instead is changing where the main dynamic range of the camera is. So in Cine EI, the camera always shoots natively. So you're either shooting at your native base 800 or your native base 4000. What Cine EI does is it lets you decide what to preserve in terms of shadows or highlights. And this is really important because it works almost the opposite of how you would think. Let's say I'm shooting on my Panasonic GH5 and light falls a little bit and I want some more light and I can't change the aperture for whatever reason. Maybe I'm at my absolute limit, I'm at 2.8 or I'm at 1.2 or whatever it is. So I might decide to add some ISO and brighten the image to retain the same look, or just to make it visible as night falls, say on a live event. I'm going to go from 400 to 600 or from 1200 to 1600 or whatever. But the way Cine EI works is quite different. So if I'm shooting in a very bright situation, rather than decreasing the light by reducing the ISO, I probably want to increase the preserved highlights by increasing my EI. So on this camera with the 800 and 4000 native base ISOs, if I'm shooting in a very bright situation, I want to be in that base 800 range. I might want to increase my Cine EI setting to say 1000 or 1600 to preserve those highlights. I'm just kind of pushing up the level at which the camera is storing the most information. Now it's going to be in the highlights. If I'm in a very dark situation, I might want to reduce it down to from, let's say, 800 to 400. So I'm preserving more of those shadows. But what's going to happen in my monitor is it's going to get brighter in that bright situation. It's going to get darker in that dark situation. But what that's letting me do is judge by eye, so that I can compensate in other ways by increasing the aperture or changing maybe the shutter angle to increase the amount of exposure that I'm getting. Like I say, it's a very unintuitive workflow to anyone that's not come from a Sony camera, but that's a little bit easier to follow and a little bit easier to deal with on the FX9 than the FS7. Many people liked to overexpose maybe by one stop, whereas with this camera, because it's got a cleaner backlit sensor that takes in more light and has kind of updated pipeline within the camera, so cleaner image overall, you're able to keep at that native level. So match your Cine EI setting to the setting of the base ISO that you're shooting at more often. And if you do that, you can be sure that you're not going to be blowing out the sensor or underexposing it, assuming that it looks correctly exposed on screen. It just basically means that you can keep your Cine setting at the native ISO and everything will be okay. You don't need to add any stops through the Cine mode. Now, we did want to do a test of the Catalyst browser stabilization in this camera. One of the standout features of the FX9 is that you can supposedly stabilize the footage using Catalyst Browse, Sony software for looking at the metadata. Rather than using sensor-based IBIS with a moving sensor to stabilize the footage, this works through recording internal gyroscopic information, positional data about how the camera is moving in space in real time. In post, Catalyst Browse is supposed to zoom in slightly on the footage and stabilize using that spatial information. Theoretically, a more sophisticated and less distorting version of what you're going to be doing in Warp Stabilizer in Premiere or Stabilizer in Resolve. However, we found that we couldn't get this to work with the kit lens that came with the camera. I'm not sure whether this is because we had OSS, the stabilization built into the lens, turned on or not. But the only clips we could actually stabilize ended up being on the Zeiss Loxia 85mm video lens. And unfortunately, those clips were taken on a tripod, so we can't actually do a side-by-side on stabilization with Catalyst Browse. But it's something to bear in mind. Do make sure before you shoot that the lens that you're shooting with will be compatible with that stabilization feature. So the camera has some issues that I mentioned, but many of those are going to be dealt with in an upcoming patch. There is a firmware patch due in October, which was announced 2 weeks ago by Sony, which is going to do a whole host of things. One of which, shockingly, is to introduce a touch screen on this monitor. So it turns out that the technology was built in all along. You can't use touchscreen right now, it doesn't do anything, and it's not even listed as a feature when you bought the camera, but the functionality was there. And what that's really useful for is selecting focus points. So right now, if you want to move the point of focus, you're going to have to use the joystick, which is cumbersome and slow, but this new functionality due in October will allow you to touch focus and pull focus by touching on the screen, just like you can do on the Canons. That, combined with arguably superior autofocus than you have in the Canon cinema line, really will make this potentially the best cinema camera for autofocus that's available on the market. As I mentioned earlier, another feature coming with the next firmware is the ability to shoot in a close to full frame 5K that will let you shoot at 50 or 60, and that should get rid of all the issues with laboriously going through the menus to change the S and Q settings on the camera. Although hopefully they'll also change it so that it remembers your S and Q setting when you go between shooting 6K and shooting 4K, because that's a really strange oversight. Sony are also adding with that firmware update eye autofocus, so eye tracking, which will lead to an even more precise ability to track just the eye. Useful if you're using a very shallow depth of field and you want to track a subject during an interview or in a dramatic scene. The October firmware update will also be adding that RAW functionality that I mentioned, as currently you can't shoot RAW at all on the camera, but I did go into the detail of why that RAW is less than ideal. Still good to have, and something that you'll get in October. You'll also be getting user LUTs for the first time. Not something that you can currently do on the camera. You can't upload your own LUTs. It's not a feature I ever really use myself, but there are lots of situations where you would really want to, for example, in television or film production. This adding functionality in patches later on might seem strange, especially if you come from a DSLR or a Canon, where even with their cinema cameras, the only major addition after purchase has been the dual pixel autofocus, which was an aftermarket purchase that you had to pay for. Or for example, the Panasonics, where you have to pay for a Vlog in the GH5 range. But with Sony, they've always done this. They've always added many, many features for free in later firmware updates. And they're really responsive to what their users want. So for example, currently the camera doesn't track animals' eyes, but that's something that they would be open to doing if there was enough user requests for it, and they've said that. It's worth thinking about that in terms of menus and issues you might have with the camera. Sony will continue to add features. For example, hypothetically down the line, it could be that the camera will be able to shoot 6K, although whether or not these cards are capable of storing the full 6K, or whether there's any point given that the 4K is already downsampled and sharp, I'm not sure. But those kinds of things are potentially in the future for the camera. Given that this is a camera that's going to be sold for 4, 5, 6 years and will have features added throughout its lifetime, there's an exciting future ahead for it, much more so than for other cameras that you buy that will never do more than it says on the box. So thanks again to Camera Kit for lending us this kit. They're the best place to go in Dublin if you want to pick up a rental or purchase not only a camera but also accessories like the G drives. In fact, we just bought one yesterday to store our ever-mounting pile of footage. I think I'm on my 6th G drive right now, six terabytes. I probably need an NAS, but they sell those too.